Alright everybody, so in this video I decided to set out to answer the burning question for laptop users. Do you go with the Ryzen 8000 series or the Intel Core Ultra series? Now, the main issue that we've always had with laptop testing is getting exactly the same models, exactly the same chassis, and almost exactly the same price in both Intel and AMD laptops has almost been impossible. But I think for this video, I've finally figured it out. So what I've got here are 4 laptops, 2 from ASUS and 2 from Lenovo. Each pair are literal clones of one another, with the only major difference being 2 use Intel and the other 2, they use AMD. On one hand, there's the new Zenbook 14 OLEDs, which are literal copy-pastes of one another from a specification standpoint, right down to their 75 watt-hour battery capacities. Our Intel Ultra 7 model does get a 1TB SSD though, which is likely the only thing contributing to its $200 premium over the AMD device. Regardless though, both models offer amazing bang for your buck. They're both ultra thin and come in under 3 pounds, so they should be a really good representation of what each platform can offer in a true thin and light form factor. In the past, we've also seen a lot of AMD laptops cheaping out on the screen, but here both of them get the exact same stunning 1200p OLED. Since ultra compact designs like these Zenbooks typically cut down on the top-end power that's available to all processors, I wanted something that allowed both platforms to stretch their legs a little bit. So that fell to the Lenovo Pro 7 series. These are 14-inch creator laptops that do allow for a lot more performance than something like the Zenbooks. And once again, we tried our best to keep the specifications as identical as possible, or at least as identical as Lenovo's configurator allowed. There are some differences though. The AMD Pro 7 uses DDR5 6400 memory that runs at tighter timings, while the Intel model has a slower though higher capacity SSD. Either way, both have basically the same price when they're similarly configured. And while the models I have use integrated graphics, here in North America they'll typically come with a discrete GPU, an RTX 4050 or 4060 on the Intel side and a 3050 on AMD. So at least around here, the Core Ultra model will always be more expensive. Another interesting thing is that the Intel device comes with a second SSD slot for additional storage upgrades, while the AMD one doesn't. And you know what you won't need an upgrade for anytime soon? That's this cooler from Arctic.
Question, why is it so cold in here? Well, I got new coolers installed. Turns out they're a little too good. They're meant for computers, you know that, right? I got them in every room. Hey, the price is just too good. I guess the large VRM fans help with cooling? Yeah. Plus the pivoting connection hoses are wonderful. I do love the styles and different sizes too. The new Arctic Freezer 3 AIOs. Please use on CPUs only. They are specifically optimized for LGA 1700 and AM54. Check them out below. Alright, have fun with your freezer.
So with all things being equal across these 2 pairs of laptops, are there any fundamental quality of life differences between the Ryzen 8000 series and Intel Core Ultra? Well, the first thing I wanted to talk about in that respect is battery life. And I have to say this again, both sets of laptops have identical battery capacities, and straight off the jump, we see the Core Ultra 7 devices have an edge over the AMD ones. This isn't shocking since we've already seen insane battery numbers from Meteor Lake, and this just confirms those findings. You might also be wondering why the Zenbook, with its lower power CPUs and larger capacity battery, is getting worse battery life than the Lenovo. Well, that's because ASUS's light load power management needs a lot of work, and that leads to the Zenbook actually getting better battery life during YouTube playback than it did in a light load scenario. We're also seeing the numbers from the Yoga Pro 7 take a massive dive here, since its CPU runs at a typically higher wattage in this situation. Either way, Intel's newest processors do have a distinct battery life advantage. If anything, their lead actually widens by a fair amount, with the Zenbook's Ultra 7 155H getting about 2.5 hours more than the AMD device. And finally, under a more CPU intensive situation, the Intel systems finally fall behind a bit, though only by a few minutes. Heavy workloads tend to just crush battery life on Windows laptops, so this shouldn't come as a surprise to anyone. Another element that typically gets completely overlooked in CPU comparisons on laptops is port selection, because Intel has always had a distinct advantage with Thunderbolt, but now that AMD has tied themselves to USB 4, a lot of that advantage is completely gone. And if you look at the Zenbooks, they're pretty similar. Both have an HDMI 2.1 output along with a USB-A connector. There's also a couple of USB-C connections, though there's one notable difference. The AMD version has two USB Type-C connectors, one of which is a USB 4 running at its maximum of 40 gigabits per second, while the other is a USB 3.2 Gen 2 with a top speed of just 10 gigabits per second. Unfortunately, that USB 4 port is the only one that supports full range charging. So if you want the fastest recharge possible, you'll need to sacrifice your highest bandwidth connector. Meanwhile, the Intel version has a pretty serious edge since it has two full-speed Thunderbolt 4 connectors that can run at 40 gigabits per second, both of which support full range charging. Lenovo has pretty much the same port layout as the Zenbooks, but they don't discriminate between AMD and Intel. Instead of going with the Core Ultra platform's full allocation of two Thunderbolt 4 connectors like ASUS did, there's a single TB4 and one USB-C rated at 10 gigabits per second. Honestly, I think that's a huge miss on their part, but at least the fastest port here isn't used for full speed charging. But I'm sure what everybody wants to know is, what about comparative performance? Well, that actually didn't go quite as planned on some of these devices, and I think it deserves a little bit of an explanation. To begin with, benchmarking laptop components isn't as simple as the desktop side, since every device is uniquely designed around its internal platform. There's huge variability. Things like cooling, power delivery, and even the size of a laptop can have a massive impact on how its internal components behave. And in the past, Intel and AMD laptops typically had very separate lanes, so they didn't share designs. And that fact that they didn't share designs means that all of the Intel versus AMD laptop testing that we've conducted, and I'm sure that's out there as well, was influenced by at least a small measure, or sometimes a bigger measure, of platform bias. Now with this test, I was hoping that we would completely overcome that. We have two sets of laptops that are virtual clones of one another. I thought we were out of the woods, but boy oh boy, was I wrong. First of all, let's show how the Ryzen 7 8840HS behaves on a 10-minute full core test on the Zenbook 14 in its highest performance mode. It hits somewhere between 42 watts and 39 watts while being pretty consistent overall. But look at how ASUS handles the Ultra 7 155H. Over time, it just keeps getting fed less and less power to the point where it averaged just 34 watts during the whole run. That puts it at a distinct disadvantage, since it leads to gradually degrading clock speeds in longer tests versus the AMD system's absolute stability through the entire 10-minute run. And honestly, it's hard to tell why ASUS is even doing this, since the Intel system is running way below its maximum temperature, whereas the 8840HS is smashing its face into the system's 95-degree thermal limiter. And look, we've talked to ASUS until we're blue in the face. We've done troubleshooting with them and hours and hours and hours of back and forth. And this hasn't changed since launch. We saw the exact same thing when the Core Ultra series was launched on a Zenbook 14 months and months ago. So it comes down to one of two possibilities. Either they're having a hell of a hard time optimizing for Intel's new platform, or at this point in time, months later, they simply don't care. Because Lenovo, well, they're absolutely on point here. Power, that's identical from one system to another. Clock speeds, those are consistent for both Intel and AMD. And temperatures, they're in check too. Actually, they're impressive when you consider both laptops are running their CPUs above 60 watts. So I guess that completely sets the stage. What we have here are two very different approaches to this comparison. On one hand, we've got the Pro 7 series, which is your true apples to apples comparison between Intel and AMD with their latest CPUs. On the other hand, I'm going to keep the Zenbooks in the charts, not because this is an accurate or perfect representation of what will happen when Intel lines up against AMD, but rather is a perfect example of what is happening in the laptop market right now, when you have a completely identical platform on Intel and AMD, and for whatever reason, the manufacturer tends to treat one very differently from the other. I should also mention that all laptops were tested in their highest performance modes in order to display the best that each platform has to offer. And the Cinebench results, well, they show how different our conclusion would have been if we'd only used the Zenbooks and called it a day. Because when the two CPUs are fed exactly the same amount of average power, they're in a virtual dead heat in an all-core workload, with Intel actually coming out with a very narrow lead. The interesting thing is that despite being fed with significantly less power, the 155H in the Zenbook is only about 15% slower than the higher wattage 8840HS. Meanwhile, in lightly threaded scenarios, power has less of an effect, so we see a truer comparison with the Ultra 7 holding a narrow lead again. And in more realistic rendering and media conversion scenarios, the new Intel CPUs stay in front of the Ryzen 7 when fed with an equal amount of juice. Meanwhile, numbers really do flip onto their heads when otherwise identical laptops have different amounts of power sent to their CPUs. More lightly threaded programs like Office apps aren't influenced by power envelopes, so overall you get identical performance regardless of the platform. Intel's biggest advantage though, that is in creator-focused apps. In completely identical setups, the Ultra 7 155H can in some cases offer a significant speed up over the 8845 and 8840HS. Even with that huge power disadvantage on the Zenbook, Intel can still put up a great fight. AMD has also made some great strides when it comes to GPU accelerated rendering in NLEs, but so has Intel, and the results in Premiere Pro aren't even close, regardless of the laptop being compared here. The same thing goes for Resolve. The Ryzen 8000 series puts up a decent fight, but that's not enough to beat the kind of acceleration Intel's Arc brings to the table. So at least in real-world applications, from our testing, Intel has, at the very least, met and in most cases surpassed what AMD is offering right now. But there is one area that AMD has historically been a lot stronger in, and that is gaming. Let's start with 3D Mark, and here the Yoga 7 Eyes Arc graphics engine pulls ahead of the AMD laptop's 780M. Meanwhile, the Zenbook's crazy power limits end up hindering performance on the Intel side in a big way. Moving on to actual gaming, and the results are all over the place, flip-flopping between AMD and Intel dominance. But while Arc is ultra competitive, a lot more than I actually expected, there is some driver limitations which cause inconsistent 1% lows, so a less fluid gameplay experience, and overall poor performance in some games. Also, these CPUs need a good amount of power to simply deliver a minimally playable experience. So ASUS's kneecapping leads to even worse gaming results, and the 155H ends up being spanked by the 8840HS. And where does this all lead us? And I'm going to be very critical of AMD again. I said this in a previous video. What they've done with the Ryzen 8000 series is simply take the 7000 series, sprinkle a little bit of that AI marketing pixie dust on it, and called it a day. What that has done is left the door wide open for Intel. And guess what? Boop! Here comes Meteor Lake walking right through that door. Because when these two architectures are lined up against one another in a true apples to apples comparison, with both in the same chassis and being fed with an identical amount of power, Intel simply has the better architecture right now. They win in most full core workloads, they dominate in creator applications, and yes, they even have an advantage now in battery life. The only area where they don't have a leg up yet is IGP gaming. And just to bust that assumption that's out there about AMD being the more affordable solution, that might have been the case in the past, but their laptop platform is now a lot more compelling, and manufacturers are pricing the laptops accordingly. As a matter of fact, if you sat me down right now and you said, Mike, you have to choose a laptop architecture to buy right now, I would actually choose neither of the current generation architectures from either AMD or Intel. That's simply because both of them are band-aid solutions meant to carry the market forward into next year when we're going to see Zen 5 go up against Lunar Lake. So what you should be doing if you absolutely need a laptop right now is buying a 2023 AMD Ryzen 7000 series laptop, and you're going to be fine for years to come. Not only that, is that they are being heavily discounted right now. I'm going to leave some links down below. I also need to mention the Zenbook again, because its results highlight what could happen at any time in any generation to either side if a manufacturer optimizes properly for one CPU architecture and completely drops the ball on another. This time, it was Intel getting shafted, but it could be AMD getting the short end of the stick on a different laptop. So of course, what that means is that do your research and make sure that your assumptions about a given laptop or at least a given architecture aren't made based on comparisons showing one very different spec to another. And most of all, I think Eber says it best: spend responsibly. Though this year, you might not want to spend at all on a new laptop.